What's up YouTube and welcome back to Homebrew Subaru. In this episode I'll be doing a set of front brakes on a Hyundai Sonata. So what's up everyone? Yes, we're doing a front brake job on a Hyundai Sonata. Buddy's car, he's got some scraping going on in the front. He's got to go on a trip, so gonna blast the wheels off, get some rotors and pads installed. Okay, so here we are at the left front wheel. I've got the steering wheel turned to the left. Gives a little easier access to the hardware holding the caliper and bracket on. To start, all we're going to need is 14 millimeter to get these caliper bolts out of the bracket or out of the sliders, and then 17 to get the bracket bolts off. These are aluminum from what I can tell, so hopefully we don't got a seized piston anywhere. Calipers seem to be an issue here with the humidity. They just love to stick, and these pads are really low, so the caliper pistons come out quite far. But we won't know until we start cracking stuff loose. So these guys just might come loose with a good shove. Usually they do for me anyway. If they don't for you, you might have to double wrench it or use a socket with a longer ratchet, or just build your muscles. The caliper feels loose. Feels like the piston went back a little bit. I'll just kind of rest it over there to the side. It is a pretty lightweight caliper. Sometimes I do like to hang them, but it's not going to be there for very long. Wow, this outer pad is roasted. We're almost down to metal on metal with that one. Just over a millimeter. The other one's got a little bit more to it, but it's toast as well. So get those over to the side, and you guys can use a breaker bar and socket to get these bolts loose, or if you have an impact, there is actually quite a bit of room to have your gun sitting in here. So I've got my impact with the swivel 17 on it. Take the bracket out of the way. The bolts. It's actually a little bit more difficult for me to set up this shot with the car being this far over, so I've had to invert the camera just to get it that close. But we've got these retaining screws that hold the rotor on for maintenance, like when performing brake work. Do they do an anti-rattle? Well, no. I mean, we've got 5 wheel studs holding the wheel on at 90 foot-pounds each. These little screws do nothing to hold the actual rotor on unless the wheel is actually removed. So a lot of times I don't put them back in because at this point in this car's life they're likely rusted in there, but hopefully they snap loose. Now this is an impacting driver. So I've got a Phillips head in the end of it. I'll snap it with the hammer and hopefully these start to turn. It started to turn, but it's also starting to seize and shear off, so maybe I'll step up the bit and hope for the best. It's turning. A lot of times the other end of the screw is so rusted that it won't actually come through all the threads and they end up breaking off. In the shop, a lot of times I just like to take a torch and just cut these guys right out. I can feel it all starting to twist. Can't believe it actually came out. Hopefully this other one's a little nicer. Needless to say, I will not get these back in. But if you do, please put anti-seize on them. Now with the retaining screws out, the rotor may still be seized on a little bit and might need a little whack with the hammer. And the rotor's off. And just before we go back together, I'm going to try and get my steel brush in here along the edge of the hub a little bit and just clean off some of this scaly rust. And always before we put the rotor back on, I'm going to take the tiniest little slick of anti-seize and just put it around the hub surface here. Try and keep it off the threads of the wheel studs. A little bit goes a long way. I've got the new premium replacement rotor. Try not to get too many fingerprints on it. Now most of the times with your pad purchase you get a new pack of shims. I didn't get any. These look relatively decent to reuse. The wire brush should clean them up almost new again. And you can see you can get them pretty cleaned up. Now I'll take some brake lubricant, not too much, and just go over the pad contacts on the shims. The whole shim does not need to be coated with this stuff, just where the pad contacts. And I usually use about a pea-size amount per pad contact, so I had about double as what I needed there, and I put glazing it all over too. That's probably a little bit too much, but the more you have, the more dirt will build up there. That looks pretty good. I'll pop out these sliders. This one's a little sticky. Actually has a little bit of rusted kind of color on it. Once you get the pins all freshly lubed up, just push them right back in, give them a good spin. And we're ready to put the bracket back on. And I know I don't normally put anti-seize on brake tightening hardware, but I know these style bolts love to seize on this shoulder, so I'm just going to put a really thin glaze right on there. No need on the threads. The threads are fairly fine, and they usually come loose when they're like that. Yeah, just a little anti-seize underneath that lock washer is going to help them come loose in the future. You can sit the bracket in place. Sometimes putting a wheel nut to hold the rotor on and hold it flush to the hub can help you line up your bracket. I usually don't waste the time. I just line it up and put them in. Now you can tighten those guys up. Now I do not know the torque spec for these bolts, and we go by what we call in school just brapping it a few times, so that's what I'm going to do. Make sure it seats. Brap. Now these pads aren't really going to matter their orientation, but there is a squealer and it should be dragging when the vehicle's in drive, so kind of positioning it like this. We're going to put it on the outside. And all that's for is just to identify when the brakes are getting low the next time. Make sure everything lines up nice. So there's a few different ways to do this, but you usually want to have an old brake pad sitting on the face of the piston so that it's got a surface pressure everywhere when we're pushing it back in, and not just pushing on one end. It is still possible to put some channel locks here and start pushing that piston in, but we are going to use a C-clamp. And then more importantly,
What's learned in school is to actually crack the bleeder open on the caliper so that the brake fluid in the caliper gets evacuated. That's not generally like normally what we do in the trade. We usually just push them back. The old fluid goes up through the system, and it's reused. And generally, when you come for a brake flush, is when it all gets flushed out. Cracking the bleeder requires bleeding afterwards, so that's generally why I don't get involved into it. And I kind of recommend that you guys don't either. There's no sense open up the hydraulics just to do a set of front brake pads and rotors. Now doing this, I just like to slowly turn it in. There's no reason to keep on crank. We're pushing back hydraulics here. The fluid has to go through a really small orifice, and it's going to take a little bit of time, so just work it slowly. If you have any resistance at all and the piston doesn't appear to be dropping, then you, my friend, have a problem, and likely the piston is seized in the bore of the caliper and you're going to need a replacement. Fortunately, this one's gone all the way back in, but now we're ready to put the caliper back on. Simple enough, just the two 14mm bolts. And if the caliper is a little resistant in going into place for you, just make sure you've got that rotor lined up. It'll make everything that much easier. Our 14mm, their slider's actually trying to turn here. I might have to hold it. This slider is actually a 17. Just make sure that's good and tight. Here comes the rain. And that's it. That's good for this side. I'll pump up the brake pedal and get my steering to the other side. I'll do the other side off camera, and then we'll call it good, because no sense on going for a road test on such an easy job. I've done a number of these front brake jobs. Just kind of wanted to show you what you'd run into, how it looked, what tools you would need if you're doing this 2015 Hyundai Sonata.
So as you can see, like most front brake jobs, it's very straightforward and quite easy to do. Very few tools to use. The wheels are actually torqued at 80 foot-pounds, so I just literally have to torque up the front wheels, and then I'll be able to go for my road test and drop it off. I kind of like doing these front brake jobs. They're, you know, good money makers for me, and they don't take me a lot of time to do. And if I can film them and get them up onto YouTube so that other people can benefit, then that's what I'll try and do. But yeah, as usual, if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here and you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button for me. Leave your questions and comments further down below, and I'll see you in the next one.